Today's presentation at the SDP San Francisco chapter meeting is Decision Making Under Uncertainty in the Water Sector by Tom Chesnutt. Thank you, Tom, for being with us, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom.
So I want to thank everyone for being here. So what I wanted to talk about was decision-making under uncertainty applied to water. And by that, I mean drinking water. And what I'd like to do is convince decision professionals that one, there are uncertainties in water, and two, there are decisions that need some assistance. So why should decision professionals care about water? Water is different, and I think to understand the uncertainty.
I'll try to take care of that.
It's okay. So in particular, water is often the example used in economics textbooks where the standard economics gets broken. So it's often a water utility that's the example of a natural monopoly, because it would not make economic sense to have two companies overbuild the same distribution network. Monopsony, a single buyer in the case of Southern California. Externalities, the textbook case used to explain that is one town putting sewer in a river that another town is using as a water supply. And the problem here is that water is a solvent. And water was also the topic that won Eleanor Ostrom the economic prize, Nobel Prize in economics, because she examined groundwater basins and how kind of a distributed approach to solution making works. So water is tied to the land, which makes it intrinsically political. I've got some maps to look at that. It's also has a special label in economics as a fugitive good. It's hard to contain. It doesn't respect political boundaries. Climate also affects demand in the opposite direction from supply. Water can be stored, and to an extent not true with some of the other network utility commodities. And there are few substitutes for water. It's a prerequisite for life, and that's going to be key to understand some of the uncertainties. So clearly there's some uncertainties about water supply we are now becoming aware of that most of water resource planning ignored, assuming that the future would be like the past. So we'll look at that. Also the possibility for natural or man-made disasters. And water supply quality. When you think about a power station, no one willingly puts electrons in their body. But the whole idea of a potable water supply system is to provide safe potable water that doesn't kill you. So we've had some really unfortunate surprises, including lead in Flint, Michigan, Legionella popping up in different buildings where cooling towers had not been maintained properly. Endocrine disruptors you may hear about, they affect the hormone system. And the one latest, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that's the what's used in Teflon frying pan. It's also used with the airport firefighting foam. And the problem is it persists for a very long time. It doesn't break down. It's been found in groundwater basins in Orange County. They've had to switch off wells. So this is the kind of uncertainty and threats to water supply via the quality angle that many hadn't seen. And clearly future, if things continue to change with weather, that can have an effect on customer demand and hence what kind of system you ought to be providing. Some of the recent technological change, it's fascinating. In Australia, they're using what they refer to as sewer sheds to detect COVID-19 exposure. So in the future, we're going to be using effluent to detect what populations, what communities have been exposed to different viral and other threats. So to give you an idea of drinking water, I scared up a map of California. And it's amazing. This is, I think, the world's largest synthetic watershed. You'll note we also have connections to the Colorado River that comes in and supplies Southern California. And you actually have water utilities in Arizona and Nevada paying for recycled water in California, and they take the water directly off of the Colorado River. So I think there's some interesting trades that have occurred, just started, and some interesting decisions that different water utilities will have to make. We can dial in a little closer to San Francisco since this is the chapter meeting. And you have a beautiful water supply system that connects to the Hetch Hetchy. And you'll note that this crosses some very earthquake vulnerable parts. Your aqueduct has been reconstructed at great cost to make it resilient against earthquakes. But I think it's important when you think about, let's see if we compare it to Southern California. Southern California does get some water from Northern California and also from the Colorado River. It also is developing desalination plants and recycled water at a stiff clip. You'll note that this is this set of graphs are from the Nature Conservancy to refer to the land connected to these watersheds. So when I refer to this as a synthetic watershed, this is all connected. So where does decision, where's the leverage for decision professionals? Well, this is a snapshot of the price index for water and sewer services that's been going up at twice the rate of general rate of inflation. And in the last 8 years, it's been 3 times the general rate. So not only is water becoming more valuable, the solutions are becoming more expensive. Let's see. So I'm going to structure a few slides taking off of research I did for the Water Research Foundation. This is forthcoming. It should be available on their Public Plus side of their website in 2 or 3 months. But I wanted everyone to be aware of the SDP smuggling I was doing. So it's walking people through how you think about uncertainty, how you identify uncertainties, how you quantify and combine them, how you attach them to things that people value, and then how you visualize and communicate that. So this is my decision quality smuggling, which I managed to work into this program for how you do this kind of analysis, because you do have to frame the problem in a way such that it admits a decision. So this is where what allows much of the other analysis to actually be useful and used. I'm assuming all of this is common knowledge to everyone on this call. So I also structure models for people using influence diagrams because it's a way to communicate visually. So often people are put off by equations, but a flow chart most people can handle. It also allows for easy observations to be made, like there's more than one set of values at stake. If I go out and buy an option for spot water on the spot market, which may or may not exist in your area, that has certain consequences on the utility. And if I don't do it, it's going to have consequences on the shortage costs. My customers pay. So there can be this tension and rightful tension about who cares about the decision and why they care about it. And this allows this to be brought to the surface and given some sunlight. In terms of calculating and combining uncertainties, I could not prevent myself from using the backronyms that Sam Savage came up with, SIPs and SERPs applied to water. That was just too much to pass up. So a SIP is a stochastic information packet, and a SLURP is a stochastic library with unit relations preserved, which allows for joint causation to be preserved when you're doing probabilistic modeling. And my example for that, this is a model I built that you can download from the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and I believe the link is down below. You can, in this case, you enter in up to 90 years of precipitation and temperature. So these are two SIPs that are related. When it rains, it tends to drive down the air temperature. So they each have independent effects, and it's important to keep those together. 1922 will happen to both at the same time. Using SIP math also allows you to grab these SIPs and display them using sparkline graphs. So directors of finance have a very fixed view of volatility as some kind of year-to-year change in cash. And you can do some quick calculations to show what the effect is on their bottom line. It's also important to be able to visualize uncertainties, and I've displayed for you now the mother of statistics who came up with one of the first infographics. She is being used by the American Statistical Association in outreach to high schools and junior high schools. So this from the Crimean War and how she communicated deaths due to pink is, I believe, wounds by bullets or shrapnel, whereas preventable deaths that had to do with the nursing and hospital programs she was setting up turned out to be much larger. But this polar graph really sucked in the general staff because they all could relate to the campaign month by month. So the idea here of setting up a quick model that you can run through an analysis and give people kind of a gut feel allows users to gain simulated experience. So these kind of paper airplane models can decatastrophize crashes and allow users to play with uncertainties, which makes them much easier to approach. This also prevents premature foregrounding while the sandbox boundaries are being explored. So I'll run through a quick example for the West Anywhere Water Agency and another backronym. It had to be WAWA, I just didn't know what it stands for. So it's a pretty little town and has certain conditions. And the question is, how might climate change affect their future reliability? So we'll cycle through these steps in the analysis. We'll have our influence diagram that has all the sources of uncertainty, the decision nodes, and here I've broken out separately the engineering department's, their focus, and then the finance department's focus. This is a typical kind of organizational tension. So they each have different decisions, and there are different value functions that feed into that. So in particular, we attach a price tag to shortages, which are nonlinear. You can accept a 10% shortage much easier than you can 40%. This is a separate paper airplane, again, all on one page, that had to do with the problem of predicting how much revenue the finance department was going to get from new connections. This is a fast-growing area in the arid West. And it turns out that the number of new connections they get each year is highly uncertain. In most years, there's a real center of gravity. But then if you hit a recession, everything tends to shut down. So it's got a very curious shape of uncertainty. And the way this ended up, it turns out fancy schmancy models with all kinds of autoregressive terms really didn't shrink the standard error that much. It's tough to predict. So we recommended simpler methods. They adhered to that, and that they pay attention to whether they were approaching recessions as to whether how concerned they should be about counting on that revenue. We also allowed risk-adjusted predictions so that the number of new connections could change, and that engineering had a very different value function. They're concerned about not having the infrastructure to meet growth. So how the part of the forecast distribution they want to examine validly. So I wanted to apply this really neat result from a study about risk indicators for bad analytics practice. I wanted to apply that to water. So based on an empirical model using risk hazards approach, there were 2 risk hazard indicators for bad analytics practice. And they included lack of accountability, that the prediction error was never examined, and there was no accountability for poor performance, and using single number proxies for uncertainty, the tendency to collapse a span of uncertainty into a single number, substituting for what is really a distribution, which can get you into trouble. So if you want to add to your buzzword bingo, these are porcupine graphs. You're walking off the screen. This is 2 of the only water utilities who have published a comparison of what their forecast had been versus the reality. So you can see in both of these, the forecasts are like the quills on a porcupine as it's walking across the graph, walking from the right to the left. Clearly, a lot of these forecasts were done to justify water infrastructure, and it turned out not to be needed. So there was a lot of economic cost that someone had to pay for that could have been avoided. So let's see.
Hey, Tom,
yes.
Back on that last slide, you say, well, we had these forecasts that were going up forever, right?
Yes.
And then you say, well, we didn't need to invest in that, but yet you had an earlier slide that showed that the cost of water was skyrocketing. It seems like maybe they invested too early, but they still needed it.
I think you have it exactly. This part of the reason why it was skyrocketing. And there are examples of water utilities that have invested in infrastructure they didn't need, which makes them less able to invest in the water structure they do need today, which is focused more on new water treatment. So they were kind of focused on the old problem, driving through life staring in your rearview mirror, that I've got to have the distribution system there to meet growth. And they're missing some of the new problem, which is how can I detect threats to my water supply and have the treatment capacity I need at the level I need available in time. So yeah, there is this tension there. And that's why the economic trade-offs are all the more important.
Yeah, well, these are interesting graphs because certainly they exist in the oil and gas industry as well, and I'm sure they exist in other industries.
Right, so I think the question is, are we investing in the right thing?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very valid question and something decision professionals could weigh in on. I wanted to go to one last example before I open it up to questions that has to do with drought pricing. So water utilities have often treated, they have drought plans, and their drought plan says, well, if we're short of water supply, we turn to our customers in May or June and tell them, you got to cut your water use back 20%. And then the water utility wakes up in September and says, hey, my volumetric revenue has been down 20% for the last 3 months. I got to raise my rates. And I can tell you that that goes over like a uranium balloon. Customers do not like doing their civic duty and then being whacked for it. So this particular issue is something that is perfectly forecastable and avoidable. And I was hired by a nonprofit to create a model to do that. This is the one I mentioned that you can download so that water utilities can build drought contingent pricing into their water rates ahead of time. So I do have a quote here from the American Statistical Association. They're quoting, accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, open, and modest. So ATOM was the abbreviation there. You can get this model at financingsustainablewater.org, and it's free. It'll only cost you an email address. There's a user guide. There's also a handbook. So you're welcome to test this out, and it's completely open. Nothing is locked down on it. Let's see, I'm going to skip that and go to, I've used this test, a little question about probability to introduce the idea of p-values. So if we want to talk about probability and evidence, what's the probability of a more than 1 decade long drought? And if you ask anyone a decade ago, they'd say 0. But I'm going to be specific. In the Southwest US, within a 50-year period, and we could do it looking at the past, trying to drive through life in our rearview mirror while staring in our rearview mirror, but better still, we'll look towards the future. So you can write down your guesstimate there, whether it's less than 1 in 100, closer to 1 in 10, 1 in 5. So if you have your p-value, I won't make anyone share that. I will give some new jargon, though they had to make up new words for this. The answer is p80. So this is research that was available, and I've been presenting this since 2015. This was on the cover of Science Magazine more recently. That's been updated for different areas and a finer level of granularity, but you can tell the effects of releasing the assumption of stationarity. So the Colorado River aqueduct was negotiated right here at this peak of moisture in the 20s, the prior 20 years, and it turns out that was the highest 20 years in the previous 500. So flow in the Colorado River in those 20 years they based the Colorado River compact on were much higher than what had been the case in the past. This is something I think most decision professionals could help water resource professionals grasp, could serve as translators, and it does have consequences about what you want to invest in. Lest I leave anyone in the San Francisco chapter feeling a bit distraught with no solutions, I wanted to bring you some solutions that a professor at Stanford, who previously was with the Association of California Water Agencies, his big 4 solutions. 1, diversify against risks, which takes common action. You have to get everyone on the same page. So finger pointing doesn't help for that. And they're also co-equal goals. There's more than one value function, and you're not going to be able to steamroll people if you need common action. So collaboration is cheaper than litigating, clearly something that California has not yet learned. And reality matters, know-how. One can do things wrong, and the way you implement things does matter. So there are usually lots of different things that need to be done at the same time to ensure you have a diversified portfolio. So with that, I'll conclude saying by reducing the cost of creating, validating, communicating probabilistic analysis, decision analysis gives permission to face uncertainty and inform decisions. Ignoring uncertainty does not make it go away. It only leads to ulcers and sleepless nights.
Well, thanks, Tom. All right, hey, can we go back to go back one slide?
to the solutions.
Yeah, the solution. So when you say diversify against risk, what are some, can you more expand on what you mean by diversify? I mean, being specific, what kind of investments you would want to make?
So one dividing line are the kind of water resource alternatives that require being brought in from a long distance. Those are much more vulnerable. And you need to balance those with more in the way of local water resources. And that's always going to be a mix. It'll be a mix of recycled water, of making better use of your existing groundwater storage so you can take the water in wet years and store it in ways that it doesn't evaporate. They are looking at warm water programs, which is a euphemism for how you can do stormwater capture, recycle water, and advanced treatment of wastewater to produce a potable water supply. So that's kind of the technical boundary. But you have to also use the water wisely. If you have huge leaks in your distribution system and you're paying a lot to bring in the water, that doesn't help. So you really need to address all of these together to diversify against the different kinds of risks you face. So they're even looking at, if you Google landscape transformation, that is a project water utilities have supported to provide information to customers how they can convert their landscape to something that's more drought tolerant, to switch away from turf grass. So that was a national research project I led, and it's seen as part of the solution.
Was artificial grass part of that?
It can be, although there's still problems. It depends on the application. It can get very hot in the summer, depending where you are, and can burn children's knees. So there are times and places where turf grass itself is very worthwhile.
I was thinking actually on the environmental side, because once the turf grass gets out of, is ready to be replaced, now I got to dispose of this stuff. And it's kind of plastic. So this is part of the balance. This is part of the balance of environmental versus the water usage.
And arguably, if the world does get hotter and drier, there will in fact be a move back towards irrigated landscape because it provides this local benefit. It has a local cooling effect. It counteracts the urban heat sink. And frankly, customers highly value their landscapes. It's really important to them.
I like my grass.
Yes. So I'll have to send you a copy of the Landscape Transformation Research Report because I think you'll like it.
How about others? What other questions do we have out there? Unmute yourself and ask a question.
So have you actually gone and tried to get a multi-attribute value function that you used with different city decision bodies, and how do you get the weightings and get them to agree and so on?
So in a sense, yes is the short answer, but it's very difficult. And sometimes if you can even get the head of engineering and the director of finance to recognize that not everyone shares their point of view, that can go a long way to getting them both on board. And it's generally, I have been involved in some of the integrated resource planning projects that do involve exactly what you pointed to. That said, it also can be a struggle because network water utilities are so much more politicized. Even the speech is politicized about what you can and can't talk about, which is why I know they're desperate if they bring me in, because I talk about everything.
So the world of these water decisions, I think is complex on the values dimension, because it's really not a single decision body that can come up with a unified value structure. It's multiple parties, so it becomes a negotiation or a multi-party decision, and not just a optimization or finding the best alternative that satisfies all the values. Okay, so it's much more in the territory of negotiation, collaboration, competition, game theoretic solutions and things like this.
But decision analysis has been productively used in public settings to display everyone's values and show some alternatives come out strong no matter which values you hold.
Yeah, and Thomas, there's a classic that we did a little video on in the Decision Education Foundation, which is called the Rigs to Reefs. So if you Google DEF, Decision Education Foundation, and look at that, Max Henryon did a very nice job with a multi-attribute and showing that you were able to come up with a solution that satisfied very extreme value structures.
Yes.
But to me, that the rest of the decision analysis fits nicely. This is where I think the art and science is really big. So if you take the COVID problem right now, and you have this evolving two camps that are politicizing it, where the scientific answers, if we didn't have any of the political environment issues to it, we might be able to solve it. But it's now it really is kind of what speaks better to my kind of audience.
Yes, my tribe.
Including their biases and confirming evidence bias and worldview and value structures and so on. It's
hard to find the middle ground. Yes.
So you made the point early on that if there's too much of the energy and value being dissipated through the conflict.
Yes.
And can we? How do we use the decision analysis or what you've done to accelerate the getting through the conflict in a way?
So I think it's worked best when it's been integrated into public participatory processes, because then everything is above board and there's no way for one side to surreptitiously lean on the levers of decisions. So sunshine can be a wonderful disinfectant.
Yeah. That's a good.
I have a kind of a multi-part question. One thing that's kind of obvious is it's a very non-linear value function, from people at one extreme dying of thirst and the other extreme dams breaking like we're seeing right now in the Northeast. And which leads to the second part of the question. I was wondering if you've done any work in flood control.
I have, which is so the exact same variability where I was talking about mega droughts. The flip side of that is, and this is something I've had to work hard to communicate, you can have the same average precipitation in a year, but in the future, it may all come in 2.5 weeks. So this future is a future variability where on average you're fine. But if you plan based on the average path, good things won't happen. So it's a world of both drought and flood. When you have droughts happening, soils get compacted, they don't store the water they do get as well. It tends to run off quicker. There are these compounding effects. So I think it's going to require some difficult collective action. And by difficult, I mean expensive.
The flow of averages.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy Schaefer.
Kathy.
John Foote sent me the invite, and so thank you, John, for letting me know about this. I'm a researcher with UC Davis. I'm actually kind of a Geezer grad. I'm working on my PhD, and
Go,
it's
girl.
in the area of flood. And so my question was, have you, because I'm going to Davis, I'm working with Jay Lund, who you may know.
Yes. He's
Have you ever used the Calvin model? How do you use that or take advantage of, or do you, or how does that work in some of the decision-making processes that you may have been involved in?
I would not describe myself as having intimate working knowledge of Calvin the model.
Okay.
So it's a big integrated
Yeah.
model, and I think the things that still need to be addressed include state planning for water resources as short as 8 years ago was using a 100-year time span. And that's so they could figure out the probabilities easier. Something about that I just find appalling. But
Yeah.
tree ring data, for example, tree ring reconstructions were rejected because we don't know what happened in August of 1922 or 1437. And that, of course, has advanced and gotten a lot more reliable. I believe the state paid for the tree lab out in Arizona to do reconstructions for the state of California. So now they've kind of removed that as an excuse. But you don't have to have a branded model to avail yourself of this.
Yeah.
You can grab Excel and download the probability management add-in and be off and running and have a paper airplane done in the afternoon. And that can be very potent, especially if the value function on shortages is nonlinear.
Interesting. Thank you. It's great.
So feel free to follow up with any emails on, I get my best questions when I hang up usually. So good luck with that.
Tom, have we shared your email address? I'm not sure.
It's on the opening and closing slides, and if anyone wants a copy of it, you can send out that PDF I sent you.
Okay, very good. I'll
It
send
has
out
it
the PDF. Yep, okay.
You can also DuckDuckGo me. I exist.
.go you? I don't know what that means.
DuckDuckGo is the private version of the search engine.
Oh, okay.
Yes, things to learn.
Never too old. Hey, I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Now, my recollection, having lived in California for a long time, I have recollections of all these California propositions. We want to take a bond measure to build this thing or that thing. We're going to be short of water, so forth and so on. And my recollection is most of those got declined. They got voted down. I mean,
The last one did.
The last one
The
did.
previous
So,
two were passed, and I believe the issue there was those who put that proposition together had not done their homework and gotten everyone on the same page. So they didn't get the universal support they needed. It wasn't a broad enough coalition.
Going further back, the peripheral canal got voted down too. Probably the same reason.
well, I mean, this is where, you know, we as a society here, SDP society, I mean, I think if we can promote communication through cumulative distribution functions and graphics and stuff rather than just words, we'd be a lot better off. You know, and even the COVID thing, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of information, and people are using, well, this is likely or whatever, and what does likely mean to some people, and it's different to other people.
So Brian, there is a vein of research about why people don't trust experts, namely that they feel that the numbers will make their decision for them. And they are wanting to preserve and protect what little freedom of action they do have. So this does have a long history, and I agree that visualizations are something that a lot of people are much more comfortable with, and especially if you can give it to them with levers they can pull. Then they really like seeing how it works. You're not telling them the answer.
I think most people agree with Mark Twain about there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
So I think the question is how do you develop simulated experience? And I think there are ways we can be more effective in that.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, Tom, I think applies beyond the water district. I mean, it applies, you know, I'm going to make the statement, and Carl, you've got a lot of experience here, but, you know, decision analysis just hasn't penetrated companies as much as we think it should have. And it may be partly due to the fact that, well, decision analysis perhaps as a decision maker, takes away my flexibility. That may result in a decision that I really don't want to take, or what I think is the best way.
So Brian, this tees up my point with the changes that have been occurring in the water world. There's a higher payoff to building coalitions. And you guys are the ones that have the tools that can help bring that about.
Yeah.
You comment that
we really have to.
The corporations, well, they haven't penetrated the governments at all.
Well, I think that the government has been penetrated on, let me say, little pockets. And the pockets are like, you know, what particular military system are we going to develop, and how do we create efficiency, and where we have military camps being closed and so on. But at the level where it gets to the big political decisions, I think, you know, the technology advisors here and there, you get a little bit of risk analysis in there and cost benefit with a little more thinking than it used to be. But I think it's a long way. Talking about who giving up authority by accepting decision analysis. We had the head of a relatively big tribal kind of a organization with lots of parts to it, and the family ran it. The chairman had his son and one other person, and they got a private 2-day training in decision quality and decision analysis. At the end of it, he really loved it. And then he said, but I want to keep this close to just us. I don't want this to go to my whole organization. And then he said, well, why? Well, I'd give up almost all of my arbitrary power.
Oh, classic.
Isn't that amazing? So giving up, so it is true. You would give up your arbitrary power if you chose to really install that. So politicians love their arbitrary power. They don't want to be held to rationality. And that's a real problem for the rest of us that want them to help us make decisions that get us the truly the most of what we want.
So Carl, I'm going to give you credit for making headway. So he liked the training. So
yeah,
it's even possible that his son may be implementing this behind his back.
Well, he's going to use it for his further advantage.
Okay.
This using decision analysis for your advantage has been around. My first experience of that was in the 70s with at that time Xerox, and they were the most infighting organization I'd ever experienced, and people fighting with each other. And basically, they adopted decision analysis as better equipment for fighting each other. So it was not making better choices as a unified decision body. It was the product developments against the R&D people, each doing their decision analysis to shoot better. And they had to have the competency to defend themselves because the other guys were getting better. but it's how
Competition.
forming a decision body, getting through the negotiations so we have a common interest
Mhm.
is a hard part in all of this. And when you get into things like water and pandemics and on all of the challenges we have at the political level, political science hasn't grown up to be a partner to this field. I think we may have to extend our field to be able to get there more, but there's a lot of art and science on that side.
Yes.
So.
I want to put in a plug on that conversation for a lot of research that's being led by Mark LaBelle out of UC Davis. He leads the environmental policy group, and he's trying to advance the science of policy making. So some of these questions that we how do you build coalitions? So he's leading efforts that actually provide some science behind that.
Kathleen, do you have a good in to him?
I do, actually.
I think if you could organize for us a program where you invite him.
I could see if he's available.
And invite a couple of us and just have a panel and have a good conversation around that, where everybody leads off with 5 or 10 minutes introduction of what their perspective is, and then we just talk about this. The challenge with that, because we are destroying a lot of what our humanity deserves by making bad decisions because we can't agree on the goal structure.
Yeah, I'll send him an email and see if I can, he's quite busy, but hopefully I could, he's also wanting to.
This is an interesting enough topic. You can get people like Ralph Keeney, okay? Ron Howard, if we wanted to, okay? But you have to contain them somehow, you have to moderate, so. But that would be an interesting topic for our chapter, and we can record it and see where it goes from there.
Sure, I'll see what I can do. I'll put something together and I'll email Brian. I guess, are you the person I coordinate these things with, if that's?
Sure, I could do that, yeah. And Carl, I assume I can share your email with her?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Very interested in this.
All right. So we got about 3 minutes left. If there's another question here, people like to ask.
I want to say, Thomas, I found it very interesting what you talked about. I love to get into real projects, very specific ones that they probably get pretty complicated and pretty confidential. What you're working on, right?
Well, that's why I presented most of the open source stuff.
Okay, well, no other questions?
Thank
okay,
you.
So thank you, Tom, for doing that. We will we'll send out the PDF of your slides here, and we are recording this. We'll get that taken care of. And send out, get that into the library of SDP. What I typically do is once it gets recorded there, I'll send out a link to people, and so you can get to it. Great. So I want to thank you all for participating, and we'll get the next chapter meeting scheduled here. When if you got any ideas, I mean, Carl and Kathleen have kind of talked about a particular type of presentation, so we might do that. But if you have other ideas for chapter meetings, let me know, and we'll. I mean, even if it's not something you have or whatever, but if you got a subject matter, maybe I can find a speaker on that. All right. So thank you all for participating. Thank you. Okay. Bye bye.
Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome, Tom. Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.
This has been a presentation and discussion by Thomas Chesnutt on decision-making under uncertainty in the water sector, presented by the San Francisco chapter of SDP. Thank you for watching.